Hi, I'm Old Norse specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. I teach at the University of Colorado Boulder, previously at UC Berkeley and UCLA. Now, as a student and instructor of Old Norse for many years, I of course also have extensive familiarity with other Old Germanic languages, including Old English. And what I want to cover in this video are a couple of different subjects related to the interaction or relationship between Old Norse and Old English, as these are fairly common questions from people. One of the most interesting subjects for a lot of people is the question of whether Old Norse and Old English would have been mutually intelligible languages. Since to us, as students of them as foreign languages, they definitely look similar, and if you know Old Norse or Old English, the other one is definitely easy to learn to read. Well, one thing to keep in mind in interpreting this question is that the textbook forms of these languages, the form of Old Norse you'll learn if you pick up a textbook from today or from 100 years ago, whether Falk's or Gordon or whatever, or if you're looking at dictionaries of Old Norse, or the same with Old English if you're looking at anything from Sweet's Anglo-Saxon Primer on, or the Bosworth-Toller Dictionary of Old English, whatever. What you're going to see there are fairly standardized forms of these languages that don't reflect all of the variety in speech and writing that existed in these languages during all the time they were spoken and in all the areas they were spoken. Our standardized textbook Old Norse tends to be Old Icelandic of about 1250 AD. This is roughly the language of most of the sagas and that most of the Eddic poems were written down in, though probably not originally composed in. And then in Old English, late West Saxon is the typical standardized form. This would reflect the language around Wessex in the late 900s or up to about the year 1000. And so clearly, if you're talking about northern England in the early Viking Age, let's say the early 800s, what you're going to have is something that's not similar to textbook, well, it's similar to, but it's not the same as textbook Old English. You're going to have an early form of Northumbrian English confronting something that's not the same as textbook Old Norse. It's not Old Icelandic in 1250, it's going to be Old Danish in the early 800s. And so basing our questions of mutual intelligibility just on those standard languages isn't actually necessarily that useful. So for example, just on the most basic level, if someone were to say, "We are Vikings," well, in textbook Old Norse, that Old Icelandic of about 1250, you would have Ver erum Vikingar. Note that I'm pronouncing this as and spelling it as Old Icelandic, not as modern Icelandic. In this video, even more than in my other videos, it's important to draw a distinction between contemporary pronunciation at the time and the way that modern Icelandic is often used to stand in for Old Norse today. All right, so Ver erum Vikingar, that would be year 1250 Icelandic. But in Old Danish of the 800s, we might expect this to sound a little bit more like Wir erum Vikingar. That's certainly a little bit different. And then if we look at standard Old English, we would have We sind Vikingas, possibly Vikingas, but I think that's probably palatalized in Old English. But if you then look at, say, early Northumbrian Old English, that would instead be We earun Vikingas, which is, or Vikingas, I suppose that S could be voiced. This is obviously a little bit more like the Norse, at least in the form of R, earun, versus Old Norse erum, instead of the Saxon form, which is sind, which might remind you, of course, of German sind. So we need to keep in mind all that variation. And of course, this is something that also comes up if you're looking at borrowings from Old Norse into English, which I'll talk about momentarily. These are borrowings largely from Old Danish in the 800s, not from textbook Old Norse, and that can explain why some words that are said to be Norse in origin don't look like the Norse form as we usually look up the Norse word. For instance, the word wand, which in Old Norse, standard textbook Old Norse is wonder. In Old Danish, you'd actually expect that to be something like wander at this time, and so the borrowing from Old Norse is more intelligible. Now, if we take a whole stanza in Old Norse, and that's what I'm going to do here. I have this classic example I use of a sentence to show people how close the languages are, which is, "I will burn your house." Now, in Standard Old Norse, that's ek vil brenna þitt hus. In Old English, we would get something like ich willa bernan þín hus. You can certainly see the similarity, but this is an artificial sentence, so I wanted to take something that's actually natural Old Norse, written by somebody other than me, and turn that into Old English to kind of give you an idea of how close and different they are. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take Hávamál, the Wisdom of Odin, stanza 138, a stanza that I use as an example of lots of different things. So here it is as it is preserved in Old Norse. This is, of course, in a form closer to that textbook, Old Icelandic, but it'll have to do. Veit ek at ek hek, vindga meði ó, nætur allar níu. Geiri undaður og gefin óðni, sjálfur sjálfum mer. Og þeim meði mangi veit, hvers hann af rótum renn. Now, serious Old English people might quibble with how I'm going to put that into your typical textbook Old English, but here's a shot. What ich, that ich hang, windgan made on, nihta alla nigon, gara wundod, and jeven wodne, selvum me, on tha made, the nan man wat, hwas he, of rotum rinth. A little bit different. You can certainly see that for the most part I'm able to use exactly cognate words. The heck in the first line in Old Norse, that KK is the result of a formerly word final NG that is a sound change in Old Norse that might have happened in the Viking Age. So it is possible that, for instance, a Dane in the 800s would have still said something like hang, more similar to the Old English form. The only word I had to make up in the Old English was mod for tree, cognate with this somewhat rare Old Norse word meither. That word might have existed in Old English. There is a word wool mode for distaff, i.e. wool tree, that could be from the same word, but it's not strictly tested, so I've got an asterisk on it. And of course, they use different words for and. The Old Norse word for and, ok, is cognate with English ik as an also, but that's never been used as a simple conjunction in English, so I just used our and. And of course, the poetic way of expressing no man in Old Norse, mangi, there's nothing like that in Old English, so I just wrote that as non-man, no man. And you can see that still, the languages are close enough that there's very good possibilities for translating poetry into poetry and having the poetry still work just fine. As far as I can tell, this works pretty well as poetry in Old English too. Although again, my specialization is in Old Norse, so don't come after me, Old English people. Now, the similarity of these two languages is something that speakers were aware of. On the Old Norse side, in Gunnlaug Saga Ormstungu, and in the first grammatical treatise, works written in the probably late 1200s and mid 1100s respectively, we have a note that people, well, in Gunnlaug Saga there's a note that seems to seek to explain the fact that our hero, Gunnlaug Wormtongue, is composing Norse poetry for an English king. But it explains that at the time, English that the English spoke the same language as the Norse. And the first grammatical treatise says, the English, who are of one tongue with us, even if both languages have changed a little, or one quite a bit. And that's actually a very aware remark when you get down to the relationship between these two languages. And on the Old English side, there's some awareness of the similarity. For instance, in the Battle of Malden, the Norse and the English seem to converse just fine. Of course, that could be a literary convention, but it's interesting to note that there's one line, 149, where it says, Forlet tho drenga sum darod of handa. And this is talking about a Viking, and so that's, then some drenger let a spear fly from his hand. So it looks like the English poet is borrowing the Norse word drenger to sort of sarcastically call this enemy Viking by the word that they use for an awesome warrior. And also we see some awareness of the similarity just by the way that Old English place names are replaced by their Old Norse equivalents in areas that the Norse settled in the Dane law. They seem to be very aware of the meanings of the English elements. So instead of just adopting the English elements wholesale, they sort of translate them into their own language. The most famous example is Old English Evrwich, bor bay, being replaced by the Norse equivalent Jorvik, which of course is what the modern English York comes from, not from the Old English form. But you also see this in the wholesale replacement of elements like Old English heu by Old Norse hauger for mound. And, you know, I think I've used the example of Spanish and Italian before, and I do think that's a rough example of where Old English and Old Norse would be in terms of mutual intelligibility during the Viking Age. People can tell the languages are related, that they're not totally alien to one another. But if you haven't actually had conscious attempts at trying to understand it before, initially you might have a pretty hard time understanding the other language. But then over time, you develop an awareness of what the correspondences of sound are. Now think about this today. If you're learning another dialect or accent or something, say you're impersonating a southern accent, you might take all of the sounds I in English, like in night or fly, and replace them with the monophthong I, because most American English speakers are aware that that's a common southern sound correspondence, so saying night and fly instead of night and fly. And in a similar way, these languages are still close enough that these correspondences are pretty visible. So for instance, where there is a long A in Old English, there is an EI diphthong in Old Norse, so stan versus stain, stone, ham versus heimer, home, an versus ein, one. Where there is a W before an O or U in Old English, the Norse equivalent lacks the W or a V. So English warm, Old English, of course it's obvious what the English word is, but I'm also to say them in the Old English forms. Old English warm, Old Norse ormer, worm, Old English wolf or wolf, and Old Norse ulver or olver. Old English woden and Old Norse Odin for the god. Old English word and Old Norse orð, word. Old English wound and Old Norse und, wound. And then elsewhere that there is a W in Old English, there is a V in Old Norse, so weather versus veather. Although at the time that V in Old Norse might still have been pronounced as a W also. In fact, I suspect in the 800s, 900s it still was, although by the 1000s I think that probably the W in Old Norse had become a V, at least in West Norse, maybe not in East Norse, but that's a subject for another video. But then many words have such close correspondences that they're virtually the same. So for instance, where you have a long O in Old English, there'll be a long O in Old Norse too. Bok versus bok for book. Stowed versus stowed in Old Norse. And of course there you could learn that unless it's following an N or an L, a final D in Old English is typically going to be a final L in Old Norse, that the sound spelled as a D with a slash. And even today, if you look at the Scandinavian languages, there are many words that betray their common origins, and these are very basic words, which is also a great indication of how close these languages are. It's easy to borrow words that are kind of peripheral to your vocabulary, right? To borrow, words like taco from Spanish or croissant from French, to use examples of things that are associated with the cuisine of speakers of those languages, but not necessarily words that are among the top 1,000 most common words in your language. But if there's a lot of correspondence between the most basic vocabulary, that's an excellent sign that the languages are truly closely, quote-unquote, genetically related, i.e. they share a common ancestor language. So even today, with the mainland Scandinavian languages, you'll find words that are spelled exactly the same as their English equivalents. They might be spelled a little bit differently, not spelled a little bit different, pronounced a little bit differently, but that's just because English and Scandinavian have undergone a few somewhat different sound changes. So for instance, the English words all, over, under, for, drive, folk, hand, and same are spelled exactly the same today in Norwegian nynorsk and mean the same thing, although they're pronounced a little bit differently. Then you have words that are spelled a little bit different, but sound almost the same. To, go, sister in Norwegian nynorsk, which I'm using as an example because it's the continental language I know best. Book, stu, book, stood. Der, vest, av, glass, koma, and ting, for there, west of, glass, come, and thing. These languages are very easy for a speaker of English to learn, and of course vice versa, which partially explains how Scandinavians often speak very good English. It's not a huge hurdle to jump to learn this language because languages are already positioned very closely, and they were even more so 1,000 years ago. Now, another thing to consider is the common heritage these languages share in culture and myth, because as speakers of closely related languages, the pre-Christian religions of the Norse and English were apparently very close too. Now, we don't actually get much written down about the pre-Christian gods in Old English. Cultural barriers were such that people were apparently not writing this stuff down sympathetically like they did in Iceland in the 1200s. But we can see in the days of the week that the gods were named with cognate names, even if we don't know the stories about them. So for instance, answering to Old Norse Tyr, Odin, Thor, and Frigg, we find that the days of the week in Old English are named for Tiu, Woden, Thunor, and Freya, which are exactly what we'd expect the names of those gods to be in Old English, based on their common Proto-Germanic ancestors, Tiwas, Wodanas, Thunras, and Frio. And so a lot of times people have tried to use the equivalent names of the Old English gods and the Old Norse gods to assume that Old English mythology must have been very similar to Old Norse mythology, and it's certainly likely that they were similar, but we also have to consider that probably in the many different centuries that separate the English from the Norse, that the mythologies had developed fairly differently, as the mythology developed fairly differently even in different parts of Scandinavia, we assume, based on certain kinds of evidence. You know, remember that all of our written evidence really comes from Iceland and doesn't necessarily reflect stories about the gods from Sweden or Denmark or such. Now, another thing that I can't go without talking about in a video about Norse and English are all the English words that come from Old Norse. Now, again, these languages are closely related to begin with, but following Viking settlement in eastern England especially, and in other parts of the British Isles, beginning in the 800s, you have a lot of words from Old Norse that come into Old English and get naturalized. And even though if you flip through a dictionary, there are more words in English that are borrowed from French or Latin or other Romance sources, the Old Norse loans tend to be deeper. They tend to be words that are in those 1,000 words you use most often. In fact, some estimations have put the Old Norse percentage of typical English words at about 10% of your daily normal vocabulary. So any words that begin with ska are not native English words, because in the history of Old English, the sound ska became sh regularly. And so most of our words that start with ska come from Old Norse. Some come from Greek and from other sources, but sky, skill, skull, those are Norse words in English. Sometimes we even have pairs where the Old Norse word is preserved alongside its Old English cognate, just with slightly differentiated meanings. Scatter versus shatter, skirt versus shirt, and skin versus shin. Words that have the g sound followed by a front vowel have a Norse origin typically too. Give, get, and guess are Norse borrowings in English. The equivalent words exist in Old English too, but they start with y, which was the regular development of g before a front vowel, an I and E, or an umlauted U or O in Old English. So the equivalents of give, get, and guess in Old English would be yevin, yetin, and I think yisin. And you can also see this in the form of words that we kept from their Old English background, like yellow and yield, versus the Old Norse cognates of those that have G's, gulr and gjalda. Take and die are very basic verbs we've borrowed from Old Norse. We've also borrowed husband and sister, which is interesting because we have the Old English words for wife and brother. Who knows what social phenomenon might be behind that. Law and egg are Old Norse words, as are words that, simple adjectives that, if your high school experience was anything like mine, you heard a lot. Ugly and awkward. And then, most fascinatingly, they, them, and their are Norse words. These do not reflect Old English hie, him, and hira, which might have been subconsciously rejected by speakers over time as being too close to he, him, and her. Instead, these come from the Old Norse masculine plural they, their, thame, and theira. And then, of course, there's many place names, especially in England and places settled directly from England, like northeastern North America, that have Old Norse place name elements. One of the most common is B, meaning farm, later town, which you see in Kirby, Derby, Grimsby, Whitby, but also A, meaning island, in a place like Ramsey, and of course Thorpe, cleared farm. And if you go around England looking at place names, you'll see that names that end in these elements cluster in areas with a lot of Viking presence, like eastern England, your Lincolnshire, Yorkshire type areas. So there was a close relationship between these languages, not just in the sense that they were descended from a relatively recent common ancestor. They'd only probably been split for a few hundred years when the Vikings and Norse re-encountered each other in England, but also in the sense that they interacted very closely during the Viking Age, and later probably Norse survived into the 1200s or so as a spoken language in parts of eastern England. And it certainly survived in Shetland and Orkney for many centuries longer than that in the form of Norn, the naturalized later dialect of Norse, which basically looks like a dialect of Norwegian that was spoken in those islands probably into the 1700s, possibly early 1800s, and influenced the dialects in those areas today. I hope that if you've enjoyed this video and similar videos on my channel, made for free in beautiful places, that you'll consider checking out my Patreon. I believe that knowledge about subjects like this shouldn't be left to Wikipedia and the public domain, and it shouldn't be locked up in an ivory tower. So I'm trying to bridge that gap and come down from the ivory tower and make available professional level knowledge about Old Norse language, myth, and related subjects in an approachable way on YouTube. And I hope that my Rocky Mountain homeland of Colorado and Wyoming makes it a more inviting viewing experience too. I also have translations of the Poetic Edda, as well as the Saga of the Volsungs with the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, and more translations coming in the near future, so I hope that you'll keep an eye out for those too. Let me thank you for your time and attention and your Patreon donations, and from beautiful Wyoming, I'm wishing you all the best.